is the place where information enters. Information enters bottom up, the instinctual brain, down here. Sensations, experiences enter from downstairs. That information goes up to the midbrain areas, the limbic areas, which is where we express emotions. And then it keeps going up to the neocortex, the thinking brain. This is where we make meaning. So a way in which we might understand that is, I'm feeling a sensation down here in my instinctive brain. I go, into my emotional brain, I go, okay, that sensation is agitation or anger or frustration. And then in the meaning brain here, I'm like, I'm feeling frustrated because of something that's going on. So this is kind of the different ways in which we make meaning. So another kind of, this is a kind of just a more conceptual kind of understanding. So we go down here in the brainstem, experience enters, sensations, felt, sense, knowing. Then it moves up to the limbic area. This is where I feel my emotions. And then we move up here to meaning making, the neocortex. Now, the reason why I'm sort of doing this kind of description of the way in which we understand and how we know what we know is that our brains develop bottom up. This is how we grow from in the womb to childhood, to adolescence, to later through the lifespan. It's through this kind of bottom-up processing that we develop. So this neocortex, the thinking brain, is the last one to be available, is the last one to come online. Brainstem is the first thing available, sensations in the body, implicit experiences, and then the limbic is sort of mid between the two. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is these are the exact areas of the brain that become dominant when we're experiencing overwhelm. Like many of the young people and their families whom you're working with, who have multiple and intersecting adversities and complexities in life, often it's kind of these kind of subcortical or lower brain structures are dominant in informing and influencing behavior because of the level of overwhelming stress, which I'm just going to roll into. So our brains develop bottom up. So that's the first concept to kind of think about and understand, which we will access across the conversation. So our brains develop bottom up. And then is the concept of toxic stress. So, a little bit of stress in life, totally fine. The stress of kind of getting organized, getting all the kind of things happening today, totally reasonable. Positive stress, a brief increase in heart rate, a mild elevation in stress hormones is positive. We get the job done. We start the presentation, everything moves smoothly, Nat's covered all the kind of needs to address for the webinar. Tolerable stress is serious, temporary stress response. Let's say I'm working remotely, like many of us are, and I'm navigating tech difficulties and Wi-Fi and multiple kind of commitments in the home. And so I'm having a period of temporary stress, but I have sufficient supports in my life, and that sort of stress is buffered. So it doesn't feel great, but it's tolerable. I can tolerate it. I don't want it to last forever. And if I didn't have my supportive relationships, it would be less tolerable, but it's kind of in the zone of can handle, but not over a long period of time. And then we have toxic stress, which is prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of sufficient protective relationships. So this domain here, this toxic stress, this is the landscape that many young people and families who find themselves navigating the homelessness system, who find themselves in a lot of kind of many dynamic stress factors going on. Often it's a life which is being soaked in toxic stress. And now when we think about why, so we've got these two concepts now that we have. Our brains develop bottom up. And when we're feeling stressed, the most recent part of our brains, the kind of thinking neocortex, big picture, is least available. So our brains develop bottom up. And also toxic stress is when we're having multiple and intersecting adversities in the absence of protective relationships. these two concepts. So toxic stress is experienced in our bodies. So I've written threat here, but we can call toxic stress a kind of somatic threat. So what happens when we're experiencing that toxic stress is that deep in the brain, there's a place called the amygdala. Many people have probably had this conversation, and I'm sure there's a lot of neuroscience knowledge already across the group. So the amygdala, or two of them, left and right, are little almond shapes, and they're like the smoke detectors. They're like smoke detector in the brain, deep in the brain. And there's, in a sense, always scanning the perimeter in terms of our sense of safety. Is there risk? Am I safe? So that they're always on, basically detecting smoke around the areas or the edges. Toxic stress, or the stress response system, is the amygdala starting to activate. The amygdala is activating and is sending a lot of stress chemistry through our bodies, saying we're in danger. Traumatic stress, toxic stress, unrelenting stress is a kind of threat to our system. And so our amygdala is telling us we're in danger and is starting to send out all the stress chemistry. Cortisol and adrenaline are starting to pump through our system. What that means also is that the thinking brain, that kind of top layer, the neocortex, the kind of green layer that we were looking at in the previous slides, that's less available to us. And so in a sense, what we're talking about is we're becoming downstairs dominant, or brainstem sensations and limbic emotions. So what we're looking at here is information is coming up. Stress is an information in the system. It's coming in here. The amygdala is, smoke detector is starting to set off its kind of warning siren. And so what's happening is that we're starting to go in a more reactive, downstairs, instinctual, survival-oriented physiology. And the thinking brain, the information is also making its way to the thinking brain. However, it takes longer, a few seconds longer. So what's happening is that the amygdala is starting to prioritize downstairs brain functioning, reactive, responsive, survival. Sometimes people call it like quick and dirty processing. It's just like big picture, quick responses. So what happens when we're having this kind of prolonged exposure to traumatic stress or unrelenting stress is that we start to actually, the smoke detector starts to, it gets stuck. It stops actually coming on and off and differentiating between safety and threat, calm and stress, this is okay, this is not okay. It sort of stops making that kind of differentiation. And it's like when the smoke detector at home gets stuck, and no amount of kind of waving a tea towel or kind of tapping with the broom will turn it off. So the smoke detector, the siren, is going. And when the siren is going, our perspective alters. All of a sudden, there's fire everywhere because our kind of lower brain structures are telling us that we're in danger. And when we're starting to operate in this subcortical kind of zone, something like a cute little tiger cub that you and I, in relative safety, relative comfort, and outside of the toxic stress zone, might look at this slide and say, there's a cute little tiger cub. Someone that's actually experiencing and navigating kind of waves and waves of toxic stress, we'll be seeing something like this. So what we understand is that prolonged traumatic stress changes the way that we experience the world. So people in a state of fear or prolonged traumatic stress retrieve information from the world differently from those who can feel calm. We know that security of the attachment bonds, so basically relationships, are a protective factor and in a sense insulate people, families and communities from the smoke detector constantly being stuck on. However, A lot of the young people and families that you're working with exactly have multiple dynamic factors in their worlds. When we're thinking about the social, cultural and political determinants of health, there are many, many stressors going on in people's families, in people's lives, that mean that there's a prolonged traumatic stress response happening in the bodies of the young people that you're working with, in the bodies of their family systems, in the bodies of the broader communities that they belong to. So in many, many ways, as support workers, you're working with individuals, families and systems that are immersed in a traumatic stress response and are actually kind of having a smoke detector signaling danger most of the time. So part of working in a neurobiologically informed way is to really deeply understand what might be happening at kind of body-based or implicit levels in people's systems and also in our own systems, and to be thinking about how do we create, how can we turn down the sound of the smoke detector in order to be able to engage in safe connection, big picture thinking, and that kind of idea of possibilities. So the third thing I want to kind of really, so we talked about the brain develops bottom up, and we've talked about the impact of toxic stress in terms of kind of setting the system into an alarm response. And the kind of third concept I really want to briefly go over, as I'm sure it's something that you're familiar with, is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is a piece of data that is ongoing. It's a longitudinal study that's been going over many decades now, looking at adverse childhood experiences and their impact across the life cycle. Now, I would assume that it's not new information to the people in this community of practice. However, there's a slide at the end which lists a whole lot of resources, both Australian and international, if you'd like to know more about the ACE study. And I'm only really going to kind of address it briefly, but the ACE study really looked at the impact of adverse experiences in childhood, and it looked at sort of 10 different domains: abuse, neglect, and psychosocial difficulties or household dysfunctions. And it looked at when these kinds of events are prevalent in the lives of infants, children, young people, when they're in the lives of people and families, what might happen across the lifespan. And what we understand is that the more ACEs people might experience in their early years, adverse childhood experiences, the more adverse events people experience before the age of 18, the exponential risk for negative health outcomes. And some of the negative health outcomes include, physical health issues, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, stroke, higher prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases, chronic obstructed airways disease, broken bones, osteoporosis, a lot of mental health challenges and mental distress, high prevalence of depression, more likely to attempt to die by suicide, more behavioural challenges, more likely to have problematic drinking, problematic substance use, less likely to be engaged in the workforce and more likely to miss work, less likely to have physical activity. It's a pretty devastating health consequences, that adversities in the early years. And so we're not just talking about people feeling low or people having mood difficulties. We're talking about people having a higher risk of heart disease, a higher propensity for a lot of public health issues and psychosocial issues. Nadine Burke-Harris is the Canadian-American paediatrician, Surgeon General of California, the first. She does a great TED Talk on adverse childhood experiences, and I highly recommend that you watch it. She presents an incredibly compelling conversation about why it's relevant for all of us. So, so we're understanding the brain develops bottom up. We understand that toxic stress really shifts and changes the way we process information. And we understand that adverse childhood experiences are actually experiences of toxic stress. And so why would we even be talking about adverse childhood experiences in this community of practice? It's something that adverse childhood experiences are surprisingly common. And there's an absolutely astronomical prevalence of adverse childhood experiences in young people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. Young people with problematic substance use, young people experiencing mental distress. If we look at the rates of adverse childhood experiences, and internationally, people are kind of, in a sense, have been doing a deep dive in the impact of ACEs for children, young people, and across the lifespan for a few decades now. And in Australia, we're only just really starting to think about what's going on here. There are family systems, intergenerational systems, who have experienced adverse childhood experiences. We need to understand. So that something to think about is that when we're thinking about risk factors and behaviours of young people, what we might be thinking, a reframe to thinking about high-risk behaviours, is that problematic substance use, mental distress, behaviours such as self-harming, cutting, kind of exposure to high risk taking, that may not be the core problem. They might just be the coping devices, a way in which young people and families are behaving, in a sense, to feel safer or to feel better, to find a way to turn down the smoke detector that started signalling early through all of the adversities. Something that the Adverse Childhood Experiences study has taught us and continues to teach us, and something that I'd really like us to kind of explore in depth in the rest of this session, is that there are many, many protective factors. Adverse childhood experiences are an increased risk. They're not someone's life written in stone. And so what are the protective factors that mitigate or buffer the potential impact of adverse experiences, or the experience of toxic and traumatic stress signalling early in the lives? And some of the young people that you're working with may be in relative safety now, but have had early experiences of adversity. Some of them may be continuing. So what are the protective factors? So relationship-rich environments, nurturing and positive relationships, safe and connected communities, love and caregiver attunement. And by caregiver, I'm also talking about support workers. And when I say love, I mean a kind of professional kind of love, not clearly a romantic love, but love is important. Culturally safe and responsive services, resilience, parental resilience. Yes, all of the kind of work about supporting parents to develop skills and awareness around attachment and relationships are incredibly important. Access to the social and cultural determinants of health, and also concrete support in times of need. These are protective factors. We can't just be building skills. Sometimes we need also the concrete, well, actually always. So I won't go into there, that's the summary, but this is kind of the ACEs kind of pyramid that's often quoted by people. And this is the kind of, I guess, the neuroscience. Adverse childhood experiences are here. Disrupted neurodevelopment. So think about what we're talking about early, toxic stress, traumatic stress, kind of the brain soaking in traumatic stress, and that it really disrupts the development of the system, and so that people might be then engaging with life more in that kind of brainstem and limbic way. So much more about sensations and reactions, and have less access to the kind of executive functioning or the thinking, big picture, pause, plan kind of areas of the brain. I prefer this kind of ACEs pyramid because it also puts here the impact of historical trauma, and adverse community experiences. If we think about the impact of colonisation on First Nation communities, if we think about the impact of poverty, someone living in, with a reduced access to economic resources, if we think about people being discriminated against, LGBTIQ people, someone from a migration background, someone who is of migration, someone who is kind of experiencing the impact of racism. Adverse community experiences are also going to have an impact because they're going to be setting off your stress response system. It's another kind of form of toxic stress. So basically, traumatic stress, prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of sufficient protective relationships and resources creates a kind of experience where right at the core of people's kind of processing and functioning, we're kind of working with a lot of reactive behaviours. The polyvagal theory is a concept that you may already be across, and it kind of talks about what happens when we are actually faced with a threat. And traumatic stress, toxic stress, adversity is a threat. So there's always a response, which is the beginning, the stimulus and the response, between there's a time. So if you've kind of grown up in relationship-rich environments, cultural capital, resourced communities, caregiver attunement, any kind of stimulus, even if it's like something risky, you're not sure what's going on, you might go to your social engagement system. You use attachment as your survival response. People are safe, people can help you, so that there's a kind of response which is called kind of the upstairs kind of functioning. Now, it might be that actually there isn't sufficient kind of relationships, or you don't have the experience of people being safety. And so you might kind of respond from an earlier part of our nervous system evolutionally. So the fight-flight response, which we've heard about before. So when that smoke detector is going off, it's the fight-flight response that's kicking in, adrenaline, cortisol. And so this is a mobilization to survive response. So we're moving to get ourselves out of some kind of danger. So this is so that safety and attachment is our kind of first response, the most evolved part of our autonomic nervous system. Then we go into danger, fight, flight, momentary freeze. So we're mobilizing to survive. But if we think that fight, flight, mobilization isn't going to get us out of danger, we might fawn or submit, please and appease. Very, very common for children. Very, very common when there's a power difference. Very, very common when, I guess, in a sense, gender-based violence. It might be that a woman fawns, submits, pleases or appeases as a survival response. So it's actually coming from a fear response. And then also there's the final response, which is the freeze, the shutdown and the collapse. This is also a survival response, but it's immobilizing. It's staying still to survive. And when we're in the immobilization response, that's coming from a place of terror. Fight, flight, which often ends up being more problematic in units or on the streets or in public health, is actually a danger response, whereas the immobilization is a terror response. We are in a very, very primitive part of our processing. We've become perfectly still in a sense to be out of harm's way, to not feel the harm. And the terror response is when we experience something that we process as an inescapable attack. So this sequence, going to lower brain structures, is something that happens for all of us. The thing is, if we think about what I spoke about earlier in terms of adverse childhood experiences, a kind of smoke detector that's constantly signaling danger. What happens is that these higher areas of the brain become less and less available to people, and they start to actually engage with the world down here in danger or terror, flipping between mobilizing survival responses and immobilizing survival responses. The more prolonged, the more ongoing, the more unpredictable, the more relentless, the overwhelm, the traumatic stress, the lower down in the kind of survival responses that people start to kind of get habituated to. So as a sense of danger increases, we actually start to, in a sense, go further and further back in our evolutionary brain responses. So, you know, this safety response is the most evolved part. Down here, the fight-flight sympathetic nervous system, this is our danger response. Down here, life threat, this is our terror response. A lot of times, and I've spent a long time working in youth homelessness, mental health, AOD services, out-of-home care, is that we're working with children and young people and family systems and sometimes communities that are, in a sense, baseline is happening here. The amount of traumatic stress that's been going on in their lives over a prolonged period of time has really shifted their systems to be in survival response a lot of the time. I won't spend time here, but you have this slide. This is so that what we're talking about is the window of tolerance. This is the safe zone. Optimal problem solving, alert and engaged, emotions, cognition, reasoning. This is where we can take in connection. Over here, we're mobilizing to survive. Yeah, we're blowing up. Down here, we're shutting down. We're in the terror state. Part of our job as support workers, part of our job, regardless of what role you have in client-facing, family engaged role that you have in homelessness, youth homelessness in particular, is we're constantly trying to work to support individuals and families to find their way back into this blue zone, into their optimal state. Prolonged activation of the stress response system creates like a somatic trauma map in people's bodies and physiologies, where their bodies are signaling danger, even when they're in relative safety. And what happens is that people are responding, in a sense, it's like a trauma vortex. People's bodies are constantly sending the messages at that subcortical, brainstem, limbic kind of area, the red and the yellow that were on the earlier slides. They're dominant. So sensations and emotions, and the sensations and emotions that people's bodies are signaling is, I'm in danger. There's something really, really wrong. And so people might be, in a sense, stuck on high arousal, combative, reactive, 0 to 100 explosive, confused, or they might be stuck off, disconnected, drifting, in a sense, numb. People might be fragmented, different pieces of their life story. Different pieces hold different bits of information. They might feel like there's such relationships are risky. And the dissociative states, the numbness, sometimes it shows up with young people as apathy. I don't care. It doesn't matter. High risk taking, disconnected from their experiences. Things like saying, I feel numb, I don't feel anything. These are so that the impact of trauma, what we've been talking about is trauma, adverse childhood experiences are trauma, toxic stress is trauma. It's a physiological trauma, it's an emotional trauma, it's a relational trauma. And the impacts of these kinds of traumas is that it really takes you out of your senses, out of your body, out of engagement, out of connection. It really compromises your sense of safety and trust. It affects your memories and perceptions. Children, young people who've experienced a lot of adversity and who've got that kind of downstairs dominant processing can look at neutral faces and interpret them as menacing. A lot of kind of research studies are looking children walking down the street, relatively neutral or blank faces. Children that have experienced adversity find the faces threatening. These things are important to understand. The neuroscience is important to understand because it gives us a clue or an idea about what we can do in our practice. So when there's been a lot of adversity, when there's been traumatic stress, when people's systems have been soaked in kind of bouncing between one crisis to another, their systems, their physiology can become quite chaotic. And also our service systems. This is what the kind of visual idea about what a service system looks like when it's organized around working with people who have experienced high degrees of trauma, adversity, and overwhelm in their lifetimes. So, here's the question. How do we use this information? Like why did Nat ask me to kind of present on this in your first community of practice? And knowing all of this, other than feeling a heavy heart, or even a potential sense of overwhelm ourselves, what can we do with it? So one of the most beautiful pieces of knowledge emerging from neuroscience and from attachment-based interpersonal neurobiology, attachment theory, lots of different bodies of work, is that resilience requires relationships, not rugged individualism. And in our work, in our practice, that's what we're doing. The relationship is the practice. There's concepts about trauma-informed care, and I've heard all the kind of different organisations that you belong to, and I'm aware that everybody's kind of talking about or across the concept of trauma-informed care, so we don't need to go there. Trauma-informed care is about the organisation making a commitment to be relationship focused. That's, in a sense, my short term. And the guiding principles are about the things that now, when we understand the impact of trauma and traumatic stress, the guiding principles about trauma-informed care make a lot of sense. So again, this is at the structural, the systemic level. However, this is a community of practice, and in a way, I'm really interested in exploring at the practitioner level, at the interface, at the kind of embodied point, the kind of therapeutic space, practitioner to young person, practitioner to parent, practitioner to carer. What can we do? So number one is we're thinking about working with young people. We need to take an ecological approach with young people and their families. When we're thinking about their natural supports, we look with an ecological map. Where are the different connections going on? And then we think about family strengths, because we've talked a lot about the adversities thus far, but there are many ways to think about family strengths, particularly when it's, beyond being a popular approach, it's actually an essential approach. So somewhere like Emerging Minds, there's plenty of resources, but I don't really want to dwell on here because this is something that can get unpacked in some other kind of, you can download the sheets. I really want to talk about, from a neurobiological perspective, what can we do to turn down the shark music in young people and family systems, and also in our own systems when we're working with within a system that's devastatingly poorly resourced, when we're working with children and families that maybe have intergenerational themes of risk and homelessness, you know, this can create a lot of distress in our own systems, our own smoke detector being activated. And so when I talk about turning down the shark music, you know, that Jaws music, how do we turn that down in the systems of the people that we work with and in our own system to be able to see clearly and build relationship-based practice that's really founded on safety? So we go back to that kind of working from the bottom up. If we know our brains develop bottom up, from brainstem to limbic to neocortex, the sensing, the emotions, and the thinking, then part of a trauma-informed way of working is to actually work bottom up, rather than just going over here, cognition, reasoning, you know, rather than just talking about strategies. We want to go down here. We want to lead with co-regulation, body regulation. When Sally was talking about the alternative therapies, music therapy, expressive arts therapy, equine therapy, animal-assisted therapy, trauma-informed yoga, these are excellent ways. They're somatic practices that really work from the bottom up. Then we want to be thinking about relationship. And then we want to be thinking about cognitive regulation, strategies and reasoning. But so when we're working with children and young people, family systems, communities that have been exposed to adversity, intersecting overwhelming life events, we really want to be working bottom up, a developmental approach. We want to be focusing on co-regulation, on relationship-based practice, and then we want to kind of be bringing in the language of the story. So how do we do that? You know, what do we do as practitioners, as support workers, as managers, as leaders, as advocates? What do we do? So we really want to be thinking about right brain to right brain connection. We want to be leading with the right brain. The right brain is the way in which mother and child communicate. It's all of the non-verbals. It's about the tone. It's about the sense, the imprint, the feeling of. And this is how we want to be leading our practice. We want to be talking in ways that really soothe a fear-driven system. When we're working with people who have that smoke detector kind of sound signaling through their system, and it might be signaling through our own system. We might have experienced our own adversities, or we might be overwhelmed for whatever reason. We want to be working to soothe the smoke detector. We want to be turning the volume down. We want to be working to turn the volume down so that other parts of their system can hear and meet us. We want to be using invitational language versus directive language. Invitational language is things like, you know, I'm curious about, you know, can you tell me a little bit more? You know, I'm wondering what else you might be noticing. This is invitational language, and we're really trying to settle the system down. Things like, you know, reflective. We want to be looking for glimmers. So we know a lot about triggers, and I go in and out of a lot of units, work with a lot of children, trauma-informed kind of school programs. And everybody wants to talk about triggers and do trigger maps and trigger plans. And I say, how about we look for glimmers, the opposite to triggers, experiences, interactions and environments, resources that help us feel safe and create possibilities for connection. You know, what are the glimmers that we see in children, in young people, in family systems, in communities that indicate to us some kind of connection with themselves, with others, with activities and environments, with community, looking for the connections, looking for the glimmers. We want to focus on co-regulation. The people that we're working with actually need us to help them, their physiological system, their downstairs brain, their brainstem, their sensing system, you know, requires our system, our regulated system, to help them come back into regulation. Self-regulation is the thing that we do in the absence of a co-regulator. Co-regulation is what humans are built for. We can self-regulate at times if we have great co-regulation templates or patterns or experiences. And this is what support workers can do. You can really actually support people to have a felt sense of co-regulation. This requires us to kind of be aware of our own internal state as practitioners, because I want to be offering a regulated system, not a dysregulated system. But if I can't actually feel into my own system, I don't know what I'm offering in the relationship environment. So I need to be constantly checking in. Where am I in my own window right now? Where am I in my brain? Am I, is my smoke detector kind of starting to signal? What do I need to do to actually find myself back into a more regulated zone, a kind of just right zone? So, and neuroception is the part of us that actually it's happening at a kind of below cognition process, but it's part of our kind of nervous system that tells us if we're safe or if we're in danger. The interoception and neuroception are two important things to understand as support workers. How do I know what I know? What's my body telling me? And how safe or how dangerous am I noticing the situation? The more we can be aware of these things, the more we can be more comfortable, more aware that we're offering a co-regulated system to the relationship environment. We need to be a thermostat, not a thermometer. That's a Bruce Perry quote. Rather than pointing out and saying, this young person is dysregulated, this young person is in fight and flight, this young person is in shutdown and freeze, rather than being a thermometer where we're just measuring where we're at, we're the thermostat. We meet them where they're at, and we either help them come down from high arousal or come up from low arousal. Calm, clear, and connected. So this is the attachment relationship. The more we're aware of ourselves, the more we can offer secure attachment in our therapeutic relationship. The roots of resilience are to be found in the sense of being understood and existing in the mind and heart of a loving, attuned, and self-possessed other. That's the therapeutic alliance. That's my old high school friend, grandpa, electrician, and an expert attachment work. That's the kind of eye gaze. We're not going to be doing that with our clients, but this is the concept in terms of a right brain. That's right brain to right brain connection going on right there. We want to be thinking about that safe zone, the highest part of our nervous system. The ventral vagal approach, the polyvagal theory is something that you can kind of have an explore of, and I'm happy to send some information. It's about social engagement, attuning to our clients, thinking about the attachment relationship, being a regulated system and offering a regulated self to the therapeutic relationship to be able to co-regulate in our work. Thinking about micro-regulation and present moments. The micro-regulation is those little present moments. It's a look, it's a moment, it's a certain smile, which helps synchronize interactions that help the young people, families that we're working with get a sense of, in the right brain, in the lower brain structure, you get me, being seen and getting got. These are micro-regulation and present moment attunement. Something really simple like kind eyes, safe hands, easy voice. Turning down the shark music, aiming for calm and clear and connected, being aware of your own internal state, to be a thermostat, not a thermometer. Prosody, the tone of your voice, the level of modulation and flexibility, it's important. It really soothes a fear-driven brain. Having kind or soft eyes, being side to side, letting people know it's okay to look away. You know, these are the kind of like the neurobiology 101s in terms of what happens when we're working with people whose systems are really signaling danger. How do we, as the first point of trauma-informed care, be safety? How do we create safety? How do we practice safety? How can we communicate safety beyond language? Open body posture, softening your muscles, connecting with the ground, finding ease in your system, having your sensory goggles on, looking at what other demands might be happening in the environment, trying to kind of decrease the demands and bringing movement into your practice. Walk the talk. Rhythm and movement can really shift downstairs brain oriented kind of states. Fight, flight, freeze. Freeze, rumination, movement is one of the best things you can do. Get up and walk. Also really great for settling down with arousal. Now, I'm not going to focus too much here because I'm mindful of time and I do want to give us some time to talk together. But in order to actually be able to practice safely, relationship-based practice, neurobiologically informed, with a deep understanding about ourselves, our felt sense and where we're at, we also need to be working in supportive structures. There needs to be some kind of focus on well-being at work, you know, that we have values aligned in our workplace, that there are strategies and resources, there's training, there's supervision, there's peer-to-peer, that there's a focus on collective care across the sector, and that we have both self and team care going on. The more of these are, in a sense, the foundations or the planks or the pillars, the things that actually we scaffold on top of. So, you know, reaching out is a really important thing. And mentally healthy workplaces, you know, are working on two levels. The structures and systems in the organisation creates psychological safety and a mentally healthy workplace. And then as practitioners, we work on our own system, our own awareness, our own regulation, what's happening in relationship-based practice, and we take care of each other. We look, listen, and link. We look out for each other. If we're working in a neurobiologically informed way, we're going to at times feel things so deeply. We need to keep an eye on each other. We need to be able to lean in. These are practitioner skills that we were talking about before, and there's a whole list of them that you can take. The slides are yours. But just in this last few minutes before we can have some time to chat, rather than just thinking about cognitive sense, we want to be thinking about body sense. To practice in a neurobiologically informed way with a depth of awareness from your brainstem, your sensations, to your limbic area, your emotions. What emotion is this interaction evoking in me? How do I know that? What is this sensation? Yeah. As well as the cognitions, the movement, the impulse to move towards or away from a particular client or family, the kind of reflective practice conversations that happen about that, is that we really need body sense. We need to be able to experience our own neurobiology and bring that as a tool and a resource into our work. So these are kind of like 3 or 4 little hacks. As you start to tune in more and more to your own physiology, it might be that you notice that actually some of the time you're checked out, or some of the time you're actually in high arousal, but you're masking it. You're like a super functional high arousal person, but actually it's like the duck on the water, your feet are pedaling, or your little kind of, what are they, little feet? Yeah, ducks, they're pedaling like crazy underneath. But on the outside, it looks kind of all cool. So as we start to tune in more and more into our body sense and practicing from a neurobiologically informed kind of level, these are some of the things. Find yourself in high arousal, or you can't actually notice anything in your system, which is telling us that you're kind of starting to maybe go into overwhelmed brain. Little hand on the heart. I don't know why. Well, I do know why from science, but we don't need to unpack that here. Couple of minutes and it just drops the heart rate. Another one is, if you can, take your shoes off. If you can't, that's okay. But feel your feet. Feel the way you connect with the earth and the earth comes up to meet you. Can really help to bring everything back in perspective. Follow your breath and exhale slowly. Inhale doesn't really matter, whichever way works for you. I mean, there's lots of different kind of concepts, 4 square, 5 finger, all the rest. It's all about the slow exhale. When you slowly exhale, it's the only thing that you can control in the autonomic nervous system, our kind of survival response system. It's the only thing you can control. A slow exhale sends the message to your brain, wow, I'm not in danger. I can't be running from a tiger because I can breathe out slowly. So I must be in relative safety. So it can really help to settle. Couple long, slow exhales. Also looking around, noticing the here and now. All of those, 5 things you can see, smell, hear, taste, touch. They're actually to help us orient back to the here and now. When we become overwhelmed, traumatic stress start to operate in downstairs brain kind of ways, we lose connection to time. We're no longer in the present moment. So orienting is a way to get back into the here and now. And another thing, if we're starting to feel overwhelmed or we're with young people and families who are starting to kind of express or are overwhelmed, it's kind of catching like wildfire. Our mirror neurons, our system starts to potentially feel the same overwhelm. But if we can't feel our outline, our shape, our boundary, where we begin in the world, where we stop and the world begins, overwhelm is infinite. So something like squeezing, padding, squishing, tapping, containing helps us remember, feel from a downstairs brain way, this is me. I exist. This is where I begin and this is where I end. And also it means that something that's distressing can be in the container rather than infinite. And, stretching out your arms wide and taking up all the space you need. It's also great for boundaries. And seeking connection. These are some really great hacks when you're starting to feel like you can't find your kind of just right zone. And, may your exhale be longer than your inhale. That's my gift and wish. These are the resources. You'll have all the slides.